We're glad to have you here. My name, we can go ahead and move to the next slide, Anthony. My name is Molly Hilligas, and I am the Network Director with Welcoming America. I lead our member support team, and I'm the moderator for today's session. Next slide, Anthony. Today is the second in a series of webinars on getting started with welcoming work. And we are excited to spend the next 90 minutes with you. Before I jump in to the content and introductions, I'd just like to share a couple of housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be sent to all registrants in the coming days. And we have opened up the chat for you all to use, as well as the Q&A. So as we move forward, you can feel free to use either one of those functions. Also, just wanted to mention that today's conversation is strictly off the record, and that we will also be having a couple of breaks in our content for to answer all of your questions. Let's see. Again, as I mentioned, this webinar, Getting Started with Welcoming Work, is the second in a series of two. The first was held on Tuesday, and if you didn't get a chance to check that out, the recording will be also sent to you as well. Before we jump into our panelists and presentations, I'd like to share just briefly about Welcoming America. Next slide, Anthony. So Welcoming America is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national organization leading a movement of inclusive communities becoming more prosperous by ensuring that everyone belongs. We believe that all people, including immigrants, are valued contributors and vital to the success of our communities and our shared future. Welcoming America's big idea is about the power of local communities to change the narrative on immigration and make sure that everyone who lives in their community feels like they belong. And Beyond Feeling has the supports in place to thrive and prosper. We partner with more than 300 members across the United States and are working internationally as well. The Welcoming Network encompasses places as diverse as Atlanta, Georgia, Austin, Minnesota, and Anchorage, Alaska. Very specifically, we utilize the framework of the Welcoming Standard as an on-ramp and a roadmap to support communities that are becoming more inclusive towards immigrants and all residents. While many of you joined us on Tuesday to talk with our leadership team and some members of the Welcoming Network about their experiences with welcoming and what it means to them, I wanted to make sure that for those of you who may not have had the chance to join or listen yet, that we ground today's very practical conversation about building a welcoming infrastructure in that same aspirational vein. And so to kick us off, I'd like to turn it over to our Senior Director of External Affairs, Daniel Valdez. Daniel?
Yes, thank you so much, Molly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this second part of our webinar series here. My name is Daniel Valdez. I'm the Senior Director of External Affairs here at Welcoming America. I oversee our functions around development, comms marketing, and strategic partnerships. Prior to this role, I had the opportunity to work with local communities as part of the Welcoming America network team that Molly leads right now. And since 2015, since I joined the organization, I have seen the power of our network and the importance of building a welcoming infrastructure. I call the city of Charlotte home. I was born in Mexico and grew up in rural North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. My family, like many others, migrated to North Carolina for a better life back in the 90s. Places like North Carolina and many communities across this country since have experienced tremendous growth in immigrant population. And whether it's in large urban areas or small rural communities, we know that the need to build a welcoming infrastructure is there. And there are many communities who are doing that work. Every community is different. And if you joined for the first part of the series, you got an opportunity to hear, as Molly mentioned earlier, from some of our amazing network members and our executive director, Rachel Parrish. And she mentioned in her remarks that every community has a different history and every community has the potential to reconcile the new and the old, and to become places where, whether we've been here for generations or just arrived, all of us can belong and thrive and be celebrated together in the place that we call home, no matter where we come from. And I think that building a welcoming infrastructure is what's going to help us achieve that, to get to that place where all of us, regardless of where we come from, regardless of any other aspects of our identity, are able to feel like we belong and we can thrive in those communities. Recently had a conversation with some community members. We were talking about building a welcoming infrastructure. And for some folks who weren't familiar with this work, they went specifically to a physical infrastructure, creating a community center, really thinking about physical aspects of this work. And those are just as important as what I think of sort of soft infrastructure, right? Making sure that we're talking about things like our building relationships within communities, across communities, building coalition, making sure that we're thinking about the narrative, and certainly, of course, the resources needed to support this work. And so thank you again for joining us today as we take a deeper dive into two of the most important aspects of welcoming: building an immigrant inclusion infrastructure and changing the narrative. While we're going to hear from my colleague Jordan on the policy and program piece, and from Lola on the narrative piece, we believe that both strategies are two sides of the same coin. And ultimately, communities must invest in both to build a sustainable infrastructure. And again, thank you. And I'd like to now introduce Jordan Crumroy, our Senior Regional Manager, to talk more about this and start going a little bit deeper into this work. So thank you again, and Jordan, sending that over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. So hello, everybody. My name is Jordan Crumroy, and I'm the Senior Regional Manager based in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is actually just a few hours down the road from Daniel. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about three basic components for advocates looking to build a more welcoming infrastructure in their community. And then I'll end by introducing the welcoming standard as a tool that you all can employ to move your work forward. So first, let's talk about where you find yourself situated and time and place. So Anthony, next slide. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this work. Your local context should greatly shape the formation of your work. In fact, the cornerstone is to creating a welcoming infrastructure is working with the elements that you have. And in order to do best by your community, you have to know your community. So what local history has informed your present day community? Who has made up your community? What demographic shifts have or are slated to occur? These sorts of questions are critical because the quest to build a welcoming infrastructure begins with understanding what has occurred and who makes up your community. There's a few different ways to do this, and different methods certainly have pros and cons. You'll likely find that having a robust knowledge of your community requires not just knowing about the community, but knowing the people of the community. And so as you see here, we recommend utilizing multiple sources for a demographic analysis, and you'll likely find that there are data sets that already exist nationally and locally, but that they probably need to be augmented. So after a demographic analysis, the next step in building a welcoming infrastructure is really mapping out the assets. So next slide, Anthony, there you go, thank you. So while demographic analysis can paint a picture, asset mapping really brings it to life. Here, a community digs into the details, the specifics, the talents, and the challenges. Surveys and things like a SWOT analysis can help you identify actionable items. If you all were here on Tuesday for the webinar, you heard Emily Yaffe from the city of San Antonio talk about her adherence to a slogan, "Nothing about us without us." So in other words, effective communities have to be at the center of the work, and in fact, leading the work. We can't create policies or programs for a population without them at the core. Once your community has done that demographic research and you've committed to the asset mapping, the next step is to assemble the right folks in the room. So building this welcoming infrastructure, it's going to require really close partnerships with various stakeholders from multiple sectors. And one of the ways that we see communities in our network build coalitions is by utilizing findings from that demographic analysis from that asset mapping to really coalesce and set forth shared goals. At Welcoming America, this standard is the best way we've found to ensure that your welcoming infrastructure isn't just talking the talk, but that it's really walking the walk. So I want to dig through the standard now as a tool for you all to utilize. So on this next slide, you'll see the Welcoming Standard's 7 framework areas. This is our way of making the implicit explicit and providing communities a really comprehensive roadmap to build inclusion for immigrants and break down barriers for all. Each of these 7 framework areas has a narrative goal as well as a significant number of indicators or metrics. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes digging deeply, actually really quickly, but going deeper into each of these 7 framework areas. And on each slide, you're also going to see a concrete example of a community in the network that's meeting that indicator. An important note here, though, is that these are just examples. These are examples of community. There's over 120 indicators within the standard that would take us much, much longer to go through. So we'll do our best here quickly. So on this first slide, you'll see government leadership. So Anthony, next slide. And what we're really looking at in the government leadership section of the standard is governments that are implementing systems and programs that strengthen community efforts that are embedding inclusion within government agencies. This framework includes commitments by government to support community-based organizations to make sure that all community members understand how to interact with city government and that there's somebody within local government whose job it is to serve immigrant residents. So here you're going to see that the indicator is taken from a standard and an example below of a community meeting it. So for this indicator, we're highlighting the folks of Bowling Green, Kentucky, who have a program called the Academy for New Americans. And this is a program that empowers new Americans to understand and participate in local government. The purpose is to provide them with tools necessary to successfully navigate city services, community info, and resources so that they can really become stakeholders in assisting their respective communities and neighborhoods. And this is a program that is run within and by local government. On this next slide, you'll see equitable access. This part of the standard ensures that community services are accessible and available to all. So it's going to cover things like language access, access to healthcare, breaking down systemic barriers that immigrants might face. An example here I'd like to highlight is from the city of Atlanta, where they've worked really diligently to promote equitable access to all municipal services, no matter the individual's language abilities. And one of the biggest things here is that they've mandated training for all city staff, which is thousands of city staff on language access services, as well as improving language services for community members. Next up, we have the connected communities part of the standard. This covers the really important commitment that we all have to build connections with each other, both as newcomers and longtime residents. The specific indicator here is that a community has a program that builds relationships between the receiving community or folks that have been in that community for a long time and the immigrant or newcomer community. So our example is from Winona, Minnesota, where a nonprofit called Project Fine hosts these monthly dinners, and they begin with a presentation and then they move into a discussion over a meal, all with the goal of creating relationships between diverse folks that might not otherwise get to know each other. Moving right along to the next framework area, which is civic engagement. When communities meet the indicators in this framework area, it means that everyone has the opportunity to fully participate in civic life and that they have access to leadership opportunities and democratic spaces. This includes commitments from the local government and community-based organizations to make sure that all community members have information on how to participate in boards and commissions, and access to things like naturalization and voter education services. So our example here comes from Portland, Maine, where they're working to ensure that no one's excluded from government or community services. They've implemented a really fantastic program called Natural Helpers, And this equips newcomers with knowledge and skills to participate in their communities as leader and really as information brokers. They provide a formal training and support to leaders and really explicitly recognize leadership skills and assets that many newcomers bring to their communities. The fifth framework area of the standard is education. And we see communities meeting the indicators of this framework by way of ensuring that they're striving for an educational system that provides support for students to not just succeed in school, but provides them with the education that they need to succeed in the workforce. An example here of one of the indicators in this framework, it talks about facilitating immigrant student access to extracurricular activities, which we all know is critical for success of young folks. And one of the ways that the school district did this was they sponsored a field trip to the Dream Iowa Youth Leadership Summit at Iowa State University. And the conference there was about uniting immigrants from across the state once a year to empower them with knowledge and skill development. And it was just a really incredible opportunity for students in middle and high school to build connections and knowledge. On the next one, you'll see economic development. This framework area makes sure that immigrants have the skills and assets to thrive, and that economic development systems are prepared to leverage new and existing talent so that ultimately communities can harness the full potential of all residents. This framework area covers everything from entrepreneurship to worker rights. And our local example here comes from the Minnesota Chamber Foundation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they're actively reaching out to ensure that immigrants and newcomers have access to resources and information about business opportunities in the region. And the Chamber of Commerce publishes these quantitative and qualitative reports on the contributions of immigrants and newcomers to the economic landscape. So not only are they promoting inclusion, but they're also combating misinformation, supporting entrepreneurs themselves and also making the case for inclusive economic development strategies across the Twin Cities. And then last but not least, we've reached the Safe Communities Framework area. This collection of metrics ensures that communities foster trust and build relationships between residents, including newcomers, and local law enforcement and safety agency. This area includes things like culturally appropriate and specific training for safety officers, as well as outreach programs that build relationships across communities. Our example here comes from the Unity Alliance of Southern Idaho, where the folks at the Alliance contract with the police force to provide the cultural component of their diversity, equity, and inclusion training that all officers are required to participate in. So that was a ton of information and surely a quick deep dive into a very comprehensive standard. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. And so I want to end by reminding you all that these indicators are just a sample of more than 100 indicators within the standard. And we've created these so that communities can really gauge progress as you build welcoming infrastructure. You can see the whole thing on our website if you just go to welcomingamerica.org. And if someone on our team can pop that link into the chat, that would be really helpful for folks. I thank you again for your time. I hope this gives you a glance into the ways that communities we work with who are ready to do the groundwork, ready to do the coalition building, are moving forward programmatic, systemic, and relational change. So Molly, with that, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Jordan. And I think now is a time where we can take some questions from you all. So if you have a burning question and you'd like to pop it into the chat, or feel free to use the Q&A. You can, again, chat your question to everyone or just to the hosts and panelists. It does look like we have a couple of questions, Jordan. So how about I read a couple off and we can kind of tackle them together. Does that sound okay to you? The first question is is about, it looks like you shared some examples from both nonprofits and city governments. How do you see both of those folks working together to, help communities become more welcoming?
Absolutely, I can take a stab at that. So the standard can be both deployed at the government level. So we actually have a certification program for cities and counties that want to go through this rigorous process of really auditing themselves to the standard. So it's certainly useful for government. For the nonprofit folks, this is a way to hold your communities accountable. So look at what are some best practices, what are some policies that we should be striving for and advocating for and holding our elected folks, accountable for. What we are seeing is that in communities where this work is moving forward well, it's a two-way street. It's a partnership. Because we know that the nonprofits can't do it alone, and certainly the governments also can't do it alone. And that's where I think that coalition building is so critical, is that folks are at the table working together to move this work forward.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, another question we have here is, how do you all at Welcoming America support communities reaching the welcoming standard, or becoming more welcoming? And I can take that one, and then Jordan, you can feel free to pop in if you would like to. So a couple of different things that I'd like to say here is, like, Welcoming America considers itself to be both a movement building organization and a membership organization. And so we support communities all across the country who are working to become more welcoming through a couple of different channels. One, like this webinar today, that is fully public and available to everyone to introduce the topic and idea, as well as other series of webinars throughout the year. And many toolkits, resources, fact sheets, and those kinds of things that can be accessed from our website and are free and available in the public domain for everyone. And then the other side of that is that we actually have a network we mentioned before of about 300 members who join Welcoming America and commit to doing some of this work in their community as a nonprofit or as a city government. And through those and through that membership, we support them with technical assistance, training programs, both sort of formal and informal. We have very specific programs, for instance, that help folks think about language access in their communities through a series of workshops where we bring in an expert to talk about that. And then we couple that with office hours where folks can get very specific advice around their own personal community. We also support our network through our regional points of contact or regional managers. And so that means, as a member of Welcoming America, you have a human who can help you navigate some of the complex issues around welcoming and help you set some goals and plans to further that work in your community. We'll send out some of those resources after this, and I think I will move on to the next question. All right. As a nonprofit person who has moved into local government, I was wondering if you have any tips on ways that local government can work to welcome developing communities that do not have a strong nonprofit. Oh, great question. I think the role, and Jordan, obviously feel free to jump in here as well. So one of the things that I think city governments really have the ability to do is be a convener for other folks in the community to come together to think about the complex issues that are facing everyone in our community. And we've seen, I think, through some very specific outreach programs at cities for specific communities, through language access. I think these are some of the ways that city government can be really supportive in this space. I also think that one of the things that city government can do is really help inform nonprofits in the area about what the demographics are in their community, so that the nonprofits can be ready to serve folks in ways that is appropriate to them. Jordan, do you have other comments on that? But we also recognize that supporting all ethnic-based community organizations as they are coming up is a really vital piece of building a welcoming infrastructure. So,
yeah, I would just add on to that you know, if what you're thinking of is kind of traditional, like immigrant serving direct service organizations, maybe those don't exist, or there's only a few. You know, I would kind of encourage you to think maybe more broadly about who else could be a strategic stakeholder to involve. So, you know, your chambers of commerce, your Main Street business owners, your hospital systems, your school systems, places where you live your daily life, places that you go. You know, those are places that, regardless of where you're from, they are forward-facing places that individuals are going to interact with. And so just because, you know, it doesn't have immigrant serving in the title doesn't mean that it's not. And so bringing those folks along into the work, and I think what Molly said about local government has an opportunity, and I would even say a responsibility, to be a convener of those folks. And then secondly, I would add that local government has a responsibility to provide services regardless of whether there are nonprofit folks at the table. So language access is federally mandated. There are policies that local governments are held to, regardless of what the nonprofit kind of, you know, how helpful the nonprofit sector is or isn't in your community. So I would say, you know, what you might want to do is look at the standard and go through and pull out places where there are specific policies or practices that are held at the local government level, and see if there are levers in your community that you can move. You'll also see words like partnership, or, you know, that clearly are pointing to that interplay between local government and nonprofits, and maybe those aren't quite as relevant. But there are specific policies and programs that local government should be implementing. And then if there aren't, you know, nonprofits rising to the top to join forces, maybe looking a little bit beyond it at those unlikely partners that could come from the business sector, the education, and the private sector as well.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I think we have time for a couple other, for two more questions, I think. And here's one. It says, I am working for a major organization in the community that is employing over 1,200 people. What are some of tips for my organization to support the Welcoming America initiative? I'm part of the DEI department at my organization. I think there's a couple ways. Let me just start by saying that we really believe that welcoming efforts are part of a larger justice movement and are intrinsically tied to all of the work in within diversity, equity, and belonging that we talk about. And I think one of the things that sometimes happens is that we start seeing EDI work as a primarily Black and white issue, and really thinking about the ways in which our immigrant communities, both newcomers and longstanding, are really impacted by some of the conversations that are happening in the community or within your organization, I think is a great place to start. I think the other piece, when you're talking about a system of a lot of folks, is really thinking about what is the internal work that we are doing as an organization, and then what's the external work that we are also doing. My assumption is that as a larger organization, you all are either a social services organization or a healthcare organization or some kind of organization providing services to the community, and so therefore really thinking about the interactions that folks have with staff on any level of the organization, I think could be a great place to start, and thinking about ways to incorporate this work into your baseline operations. And then I also think that as a large organization, there's a piece here around changing around talking about assets in your community and talking about demographic change as a positive thing. And as a leader of a large organization, I think that's also a role that folks can play, and something that we're going to be talking quite substantially about in the next part of our webinar. Jordan, I don't know if you have other things to add to that as well.
I think that was great. I think without knowing, much more, I would say, I think what you said about looking internally and then looking externally is a helpful way to kind of divide and conquer, because a lot of times this work feels really overwhelming. You're either going to look at your community and say like, oh my goodness, we don't have, X, Y, and Z, or, oh my goodness, we have all of these challenges coming up, and it is quite overwhelming. So I think dividing it into that internal and external is really helpful. The other thing that I always encourage folks to do is there's glass half full, glass half empty people. I'm a glass half empty. So my approach to this work is like, what are the problems? What are the barriers, right? So if I'm in that organization that the person posed the question, I'm looking at like, how are we preventing people from fully belonging? What are our systemic or cultural challenges that make folks feel excluded? What sort of HR practices do we need to change? Right. So I'm looking at like the negative, the barriers, the problems, the challenges, and that's where I get energy. Other folks are the glass half full, and they're looking at what is our organization or our what do we do really well? Where are the bright spots? Where are we really not just welcoming diversity, but really celebrating and providing equitable access to folks within this company? I think those are two different approaches. They're both needed. We try to all do both, but we probably lean one way or the other. And I think that's another helpful way of breaking it down. The task is insurmountable, right? To create welcoming communities. And so looking at internally, looking at externally, but then also looking at like, what are we doing well? And how do we share that? How do we share that with other companies, with other organizations? How do we share this positive narrative with our community who feels devastated by a constant, influx of terrible news and challenges? And then also looking at the barriers side.
You can see how Jordan and I might play good cop, bad cop on several conversations by our answers there. All right, I just have one more question, and it is really about demographics, and it is. The question reads, my community is not a very diverse community. Is welcoming still for me?
I mean, we have to say yes, right? Like that, we have to say yes, of course. This maybe goes back to the last answer. I think there's ways, the first question I would have is why, right? Like why is it not diverse? And is that actually true? What are the ways in which diversity plays out? And if it really is true, I think also looking at why. One of the first things I think I talked about in this presentation was doing that demographic analysis. And then maybe you do that and you find out it is true. And then the second step is doing that asset mapping to figure out why is this happening? Who are the folks at the table? What are the ways in which our community is preventing, you don't want to move to a neighborhood if you don't feel welcome. You don't want to buy a house and send your kids to school and, invest in that community. And so maybe there are some kind of internal facing ways that you can investigate. Why is that the case? Is it within your control? Is it within local government's control? But I think starting with that demographic analysis and asset mapping is probably the place to look first.
Excellent. And I also would just add that we really believe that welcoming offers communities a proactive way to start thinking about equity. And so when we're really leading with our values and talking about the ways in which we can create spaces where we can all belong and thrive, doing that proactive work can really be essential for when times do arise where we need to be considering some of those other aspects of the work. All right. Well, I think that we're going to go ahead and move on to the second part of our webinar. So thank you so much for all your questions. Jordan, thank you so much for your expertise and for that deep dive into the welcoming standard and what it means to really kick off demographic analysis and coalition building and asset mapping in our communities. As I mentioned, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and move to a discussion around narrative change, which, as Daniel mentioned, is really the other side of the coin when it comes to building a welcoming infrastructure and the basis for creating a different story in our communities, one of welcome, one of inclusion, and one of abundance. So we're lucky today to be joined by Lola Pak, our communications director here at Welcoming America. And so Lola, thanks so much for sharing your expertise today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Molly. Yeah, I really just want to piggyback off of Jordan and, say that narrative change and, the kind of perceptions that people have about welcoming work are kind of go hand in hand with really building that welcoming infrastructure locally. So thanks for that lead in. So next slide, please. All right, so I'm happy to be here today to talk about the role of narrative in welcoming work and specifically how to shift or change narratives. So as many of you are probably aware, narratives are a key component of welcoming work, and because no matter what specific area of the work that you are involved in, we know how narrative impacts how people broadly understand or perceive the work. Immigration, I would say in particular, is an issue rife with narratives. So no matter which side of the aisle you are on, and so to change the narratives, we must, I think, take a step back to first understand what narratives are. Next slide. All right, so I want to start with this handy diagram and explainer from the organization, the Narrative Initiative. And because I think we often think of narratives as this nebulous concept that is hard to define, but intuitively understood. The reality is that narratives are kind of a part of a sea of concepts that flow together. Next slide. So at the top, we have stories and messages, which are the parts most visible and relatable to people. I'm going to share an example about a shark attack and then have that be inform the different components of this diagram. So when we think of stories and messages, an example of that could be, 5 swimmers were attacked by a shark along the east coast of the United States. Next slide. And then below the surface of those stories are narratives. So narratives can be thought of as a collection of stories refined over time, and they also infuse the stories with deeper meaning. So to go back to the shark story, a narrative based on that are sharks are vicious, man-eating predators that frequently attack and kill human beings. Next slide. At the very bottom, lying underneath the narratives is our values and worldviews. And this is how these inform how we perceive the narratives, the stories, and the messages we see out in the world. And so to follow on with the shark story, a potential worldview from all of that could be humans and nature are in a continual battle for dominance, and we're defenseless against nature and should fear the unknown. The point I want to make here is that when you're working towards narrative change, you have to consider all of the messages, stories, values, and worldviews that impact the prevailing narrative in order to make any meaningful change. And that's kind of how the sea of narrative change can go. Next slide. All right, so I want to now focus on how narrative impacts immigration. Next slide. So we often see stories like this in the media, and when they're collectively out there in your news feeds, on the TV, on the radio, they feed this narrative that immigration is very chaotic and too complicated to engage with. But we know as welcomers that these are not the only stories about immigration that exist. The challenge for us is not to, as tempting as it is, to counter each story with reasons why they're not true, but to create and grow a counter narrative at a larger scale and with consistency over time. And that is not easy work. But over time, telling different stories, lots of stories, will sink into the prevailing narrative. And the idea is that it'll ultimately sink further to impact individual values and worldviews into a positive direction on immigration and welcoming at large. Next slide. So how do you begin to shift the narrative? Next slide. Okay, first, you want to identify the message that you want to convey. One of the pitfalls that I often see of telling stories and messages from either nonprofits or local governments is that there's so many to tell, but if you tell them all without a coherent message, people don't ultimately understand what you're trying to say. So it's important to focus the message that are achievable. This is a tactic that's often used by advocacy organizations that have a focused goal on achieving policy outcomes. But you can also use it in a number of other contexts too, not just for advocating certain policies. It's also important to make sure that your stories and your messages align with your organizational goals. So if you have a goal to, let's say, engage more Latinx individuals in your work, but your messaging is all in English or not addressing the community's main concerns, there is clearly some alignment that needs to happen. And then lastly, I would just suggest keeping the message tight and consistent. A lot of us work on complex issues that rarely stay in just the lane of immigration or housing or food security. I think the key is not to reduce the complexity of your work, but it's to talk about them in a more focused manner and again, consistently over time. Next slide. Second, I would have stories that affirm your messaging. So reinforcing shared values is one of the ways to do this and also to achieve narrative change. By focusing on shared values, we create a vision for working together on issues that impact all of us rather than despairing at our differences. So for example, in most communities, a lot of communities would say that, being welcoming is a value and having respect for one another's beliefs. And it's important to be engaged in the community. So leaning into stories that highlight these values offer a great counterpoint to the more divisive narratives. Another approach is what we call the abundance versus scarcity mentality. So a recent example of this is in the news was about the busing of migrants from the southern border to the quote unquote more liberal cities. And the message that they were trying to send with this was that there weren't enough resources in this nation to support migrants. But the fact that this is untrue, that we know, is beside the point. Because remember, one's values and worldviews impact their narrative perception about immigration. So instead, we suggest sharing stories that affirm a message of abundance while also touching on shared values. And this can sound like, our city is one where anyone is welcome, including migrants, and here is how our community gathered to welcome the newcomers. Next slide. Thirdly, we would recommend engaging spokespeople who are like the audience. So kind of like developing an affinity between the messenger and the messages, making sure that they are racially and ethnically diverse, and as well as including people who come from both immigrant and non-immigrant backgrounds. We would suggest considering community influencers like faith leaders, elected officials, or even just the kid down the street who puts out great TikTok videos about how much he loves his neighbors. Some of the great examples of organizations who do this well are here, the Refugee Congress's Storytellers Collective, where they proactively engage people of refugee backgrounds to tell their own stories in their voice. Next slide. And lastly, we would say activating the community through larger and or pre-existing narratives is another way to sort of achieve narrative change. Narrative work is hard and very much a long-term effort. And the more you can tie your stories and messages to multiple narratives, especially pre-existing ones, the more likely you can kind of work towards shifting the narrative. So that's why we suggest campaigns like Welcoming Week, not that we're biased, Immigrant Heritage Month, National Immigrant Day, and World Refugee Day. So these are all already well-recognized global campaigns and initiatives that have positive narratives connected to them. And the more you can tie your narratives and messages and stories to those things as well, you can kind of start to create over time a narrative shift in the things you're trying to achieve. Next slide. I wanted to end on this slide, just my portion of the presentation, so that we can hopefully see how all of the suggestions shared here kind of flow back up to that core concept of what narratives are. Again, narrative change is long-term work, and the messages and stories are important for gaining immediate and short-term understanding, but they should feed into deeper narrative over time to really change hearts and minds. And ideally, the narratives should then penetrate even deeper to impact individual values and worldviews that, again, over the long term, shift narratives and help us bring us closer to the change that we want to see. So that's it for me. Thanks for your time. Look forward to any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Lola. And we do have a couple of questions here. So, all right. The first one is actually about what's happening in a community. So what the question reads, our problem is not that anyone locally is necessarily telling negative messages about immigrants, but that nobody's telling any story at all. It's like just crickets. How do we approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's an issue that maybe could stem from a lot of different places. Maybe the stories like are being told, but in different spaces or not in the spaces that we hope, right? Not everybody's into doing social media. Not everybody's all about chatting from the rooftops about, what they believe or their values. So it can kind of make it harder to see where the stories are actually happening, but they're clearly there because none of us live in a vacuum. Like, this is life, it happens on the ground, and so things do happen, but it's just a matter of, I think, connecting with the right people and being a trusted source to kind of be a steward for that story, I think. So kind of back to almost Jordan's point about, asset mapping and kind of getting the lay of the land with your community, just kind of having those connections pre-existing, I think, like creates, ultimately will create the funnel for those stories to come forth.
Absolutely, thank you. I have another question about national narrative versus local narrative. It feels like right now, and for the past several years, it's the national narrative around immigration has really been about a crisis. And I know that our local folks are doing wonderful things. How do we balance that, and what are some strategies that our communities can use to I don't know if we want to counter those national narratives right up front, or just create our own positive narratives? What's the best way to think about that?
Yeah, I think part of this is also trying to understand the media landscape. There's a saying with journalists, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't read, meaning that there's a crisis orientation just with journalists, right? There's more of that sense of urgency. That's kind of just like how they tend to be wired. And so that's what captures attention. And I guess there's even the term where it's soft stories, the good things that happen, in communities tend to get put in this category of being soft or not urgent. And so therefore, they don't seem to get this priority, and they definitely don't balance out the other kind of crisis tones and pieces that come out. So when you look at it from that point of view, I think if your organization is able to have the resources, it's also a relationship building thing with local media, to especially just kind of make sure that they know who to go to for the counter response, because reporters genuinely do want to provide a balanced perspective on all the issues that they report on. And so, but it's often they don't have the time to find out who is there, and whoever they reach out to, they need to get a very quick response. And so, organizations that have the capacity and resources to maintain those relationships with local media, especially, tend to fare better, I suppose, and are at least able to kind of chip away at the overwhelming kind of imbalance with crisis media. But even if that's not the case, and you don't have a PR expert on your team, it's just making sure you put out the stories that you do get into the world. So that would primarily be something like social media. You have a really successful food drive that went away. Put the picture out there, and then as I mentioned in my portion about consistency, I think that's really the key here, because we know that, and that's really hard to achieve because we know how much work organizations do, and there's often not even the space to think about some of the very important logistical things, let alone to post a picture on social media. But I just trust me when I say that, just over time though, like you build that attention online and putting out content and just like bragging almost like in those spaces about like, just how much work like your community is doing, like all the great things it's achieving, all the wonderful stories that come out of it, gains that attention over time, or gains the attention of somebody. And then you become seen as like sort of this local resources that reporters and others can go to for, the counter narrative.
Yeah, that's such excellent advice. We've got a question here that's a little bit less around like media, but also just around this work in deep community work. And it's how do you align your nonprofit narrative with those of local foundations or funders without compromising your values? It's weary trying to fit into their priorities. And we had a couple other questions about like, people love sharing stories about immigrant excellence, but that doesn't tell the whole story. I think these are very like intertwined. And do you have some advice for folks who are trying to do that? And I know something that Welcoming America also looks to do as well on the national landscape, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like all companies, organizations of any size is just constantly trying to tell their story, tell it accurately. And we're all just desperately just trying to make sure that we feel like kind of seen and understood. So I'll kind of address the first part about, nonprofits and like foundations and how to kind of like align values. I think this might be more of a development tactic probably, but I know it can be a challenge because it's like, funding to do the work, but then like you have the work and you have goals and you want to find people that kind of help support those things. I mean, I guess apart from, just making sure that you just find funders like, who see you for who you are and kind of going with them and making sure that you present an accurate picture of who you are and just not compromising on that front. I would say that's kind of in some ways the beauty of welcoming work is that it tends to encompass a lot of different areas. Like I mentioned, but even immigration as an issue. Yeah, you might be serving immigrant communities, but it's likely that, you also work with, housing and food and school systems, and the welcoming standard clearly conveys like, all the different areas of communities that need to be kind of aligned in order to kind of funnel up to this idea of welcoming. And so, in that sense, I mean, foundations, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I guess like, they also tend to try to be broad and find like, holistic or comprehensive solutions to some of the problems they're trying to address. And so I would think like, trying to present the organization in that way and leaning into the, again, welcoming values, welcoming standard, those kinds of things are kind of great ways to cover a lot of bases, but also still, I would hope like, maintain the core of the goals that you guys are trying to achieve. But yes, we know that it can be challenging to kind of, I don't think we're immune to that either, to try to fit into funders' priorities as well. I guess the second part of that and telling the whole story, there's, yes, you do sometimes have to give, stories can be challenging because, they have to be focused. They often have to stay short, just to kind of hold people's attention. But I think this is kind of where volume and over time really tend to be the key things. You're never going to capture the full picture of your organization's work with one blog post or one video. It's sort of like building up to all these things over time and then doing it through different mediums and just having a few people on team, like, just consistently look at, and revisit like all the core messages that you're trying to send as an organization. And I think really kind of creating filters, for your organization to sift your stories through to make sure they kind of are meeting these values. So for us, that looks like, okay, we've heard this great story about one of our members, like, doing something really amazing, like putting out a welcoming plan in like their community, which is a huge achievement. Where within our welcoming standard framework can we talk about this achievement? And having that kind of like go back and then tailoring the story like in that sense is really what helps us, kind of stay true to the messages and the narrative that we're trying to push. But at the same time, telling these smaller stories that help make it a little bit more understandable for the average person. And that just means kind of, I think, deciding collectively what standards to kind of adhere to and, just which stories to tell, and also recognizing that you cannot tell all the stories all the time. There are too many out there, and hence going back and like kind of creating a focus for yourself is really critical.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I think we have time for just like two more questions. And one I think really kind of combines both of Jordan and Lola's discussion here. And it asks, our mayor always talks about how much he loves diversity, but our government doesn't actually fund any projects that support equity and welcoming. And the government itself the makeup is not very diverse. How would you suggest we handle that? And, I think Jordan and or Lola, I think this question could go to either of you, honestly.
Jordan, you want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, that's infuriating. That's that's probably my the least favorite thing to hear, because it is really frustrating. So I would say first, I would understand why you are frustrated in asking that question. I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but I do think the standard can be helpful. Local governments, they compete. They want to compete with other cities. And so, using the standard and also using certification to say, these other communities are certified, hey, I'm not asking you to get certified, but can't we at least try this or that program? Why don't we start here? Why don't we become a member? So I think that can be helpful. And, I think there are other ways to hold folks accountable, especially electeds. Thankfully, maybe it's getting out the vote work. Maybe it's going to a city council meeting and speaking up and saying, you talk about how affirming you are, but here's the glass half full. Here are the things that we're not seeing, or here are the things that we're hearing from community. So I would look to formal tools like the standard, like certification. Does your community have a strategic plan for immigrant integration? Are you paying multilingual police officers more? Do you have an office of equity? There are specific metrics that you could take back to the mayor. But I also think there's other tactics when it's an elected as well.
I would say from a narrative approach, if you are wanting to go about it that way, maybe making it clearer to local officials about just how much this is not just like a niche issue, or just like one or a small group of people advocating for this, but demonstrating how the majority of the community this is something that they want to see. And so kind of maybe some of the ways I've seen this kind of roll out are, putting an op-ed like in your local paper, with like a local multiracial organization or leadership, or just like demonstrating it through other ways, like on social media, or just through like other events hosted by the city or local government, and just showing up and kind of making sure that diverse coalitions are kind of represented, and then all uniting around it. And so providing things like toolkits, messaging, talking points, like that kind of thing to kind of all the interested parties, to getting this through, and then having just like a messaging strategy to kind of go after this, and cheering it on. And especially around election season, I would think like this could be one of those issues that could be advocated for. But having a broad range of people being part of that and kind of speaking the same message very consistently, I think could help move the needle in that way and develop and change public perception.
I think we'll just do one more, one that I think will be pretty quick. Lola, do you have some advice for folks if they are just starting to think about what some narrative change work might look like in their community, or they're an organization who has been more focused on service delivery, but is really thinking about this piece as sort of the next frontier for them?
Yeah, I think it actually helps to start kind of similar to Jordan's, first suggestion about getting like the demographic assessment. It's also doing some sort of like external assessment of your existing communications assets, right? So just how, I guess, like, is the organization, or how is your work perceived in the community? Either like talking to people, doing surveys, and just getting like the sense, because oftentimes if you're the one doing the work, like you really think you're coming off like one way and that this is kind of how you would want to be perceived. But then oftentimes when you do these assessments, like, it could end up being very different. And so other people from the outside can kind of help you look at sort of the gaps that are there. And then you can kind of like start to form like, okay, well, this is people clearly don't think or perceive us as doing this part of the work, but I think we do great work in this area. And I want people to know that. And then so kind of identifying those gaps, I think, and then changing your updating sort of like any external assets that you have, like things like your websites, like your social media platform. I know sometimes like organizations hire volunteers from local schools or young people to kind of help and can jump into like their social media and help them out with their digital work. I think another thing is, you know, even if like you're not into kind of doing all the digital space and all that work and stuff, starting then again, developing relationships with local media and just kind of letting them know and sharing consistently with them, like, hey, we're doing this event. Hey, we're doing this. We're rolling out this award. We're rolling out this program. We're engaging these communities. And again, reporters are busy people. So sometimes they don't always answer to everything. In fact, they ignore a lot of things, but over time, you know, you never know if something related to your issue area kind of gets floated to sort of a local or even national interest. And so, you know, just making sure that you're kind of laying the groundwork to develop those relationships and them knowing you as the person to go to for these types of issues for like a quote or something kind of helps to start build that difference, I think, in the narrative that you're wanting to see change.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you, Lola. Thank you, Jordan. And as a quick wrap up, I would just like to share a little bit more information about the Welcoming Network and some other things that we have going on in case our conversation today has sparked significant interest in yourself and you'd like to get a little bit more involved with the work that we are doing, or you'd like to get something started in your community or work on something more deeply. So first off, the members are a huge part of what we do here at Welcoming America. And through our network, members receive access to tools, resources, technical assistance, and a global peer network of nonprofit and government organizations who are really doing transformational community work. Participating members can connect with their peers, ask questions, and get guidance based on their experiences, as well as share accomplishments and ideas from their communities. If you are joining us today and your organization is considering membership in the network, I invite you to visit our website, specifically the Welcoming Network page, and we can share that link in the chat. Now, just to dig a little deeper into what the membership looks like, over the years, our network membership has continued to grow, and currently we have around 300 members. As you can see, membership is comprised of nonprofit organizations and local governments. We also are growing our international efforts to provide an opportunity to exchange best practices between globally inclusive cities. Now, some of the benefits that folks can receive through membership are coaching and strategy planning that is really tailored to your specific project or a question, and that you can access anytime with your regional point of contact. These calls often result in next steps such as direction towards relevant research, talking points, a connection to a national partner, or being connected to a peer organization who is working on an issue similar to yours. In addition to some of that more informal coaching, we also offer a variety of webinars, many of which are exclusive to members on topics such as bridge building strategies, language access, building a welcoming or inclusive economy, and community planning for immigrant inclusion. Members also receive exclusive opportunities to join communities of practice that are geared toward a specific topic or need. These programs are designed to allow for connection between members and the cultivation of ideas and challenges that help improve the opportunities for folks to apply their work in their community. And as these programs become available, members will receive exclusive communications on how to apply and for scholarships to participate. And then one of the other pieces that we mentioned earlier was around our certification program. Over the past 2 years, Welcoming America has been working to update our welcoming standard. And as we mentioned earlier, this welcoming standard serves as our roadmap for our road to certification, and is really the backbone of that piece. Certification has distinguished localities for their work, and now will can help you chart a clearer course and distinguish those who are very advanced and those who are still sort of working towards that highest benchmark. We are really thinking about the ways in which our communities interact with the welcoming standard and move through certification. And so later in 2023, we will be launching the Welcoming Standard 2.0 and a tiered certification system that will allow more communities to participate in that program. We're currently running a pilot program to make sure that we are providing the best services possible to all those in our network, and that our certification program continues to uplift the fantastic work that localities are doing. Additionally, beginning in the spring of 2023, our certification team will be offering info sessions that include an introduction to certification, mini boot camps to the welcoming standard, and drop-in office hours. And those are available to anyone, regardless of your participation in the welcoming network. And then just a couple of other quick things to mention. One is that coming up in May of this year, it's actually April. I'm sorry, y'all. That coming up in April, we are going to be having our Welcoming Interactive. And our Welcoming Interactive is our annual conference that this year will be hosted in the city of San Jose, California. And this is a time to gather together, connect with new and old friends, and learn from a variety of presenters, share with peers, and really dig deep into many more of the topics that we discussed today and many of the areas of the standard. So for those of you who are interested in that, there is some opportunity to plug in early in the new year. And then, I guess the final piece here is that if you are interested in learning more about membership, you can please feel free to email the membership at Welcoming America inbox, or any of us on the call today would be happy to answer any of your questions. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And we invite you to keep in touch with us through our social channels and by visiting our website for resources. Once again, thanks so much for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.